Hard-coded credentials can be trouble, but not as much trouble as a vulnerable DevOps environment. If you want protection without the hassle of security slowing you down, CyberArk, the #1 provider in privileged access security, has the solution for you. With CyberArk Conjur, developers can easily secure secrets across any DevOps toolchain or platform, whether your application runs in the cloud or on premises. Eliminate the headaches of managing secrets and try Conjur open source for free with no strings attached. Visit conjur.org/ASW to get started today. Do you need a web application security solution that can improve your detection rate and enable easier remediation? Acunetics has a fully automated solution that can detect and report over 4,500 web vulnerabilities. Fast and scalable, it can scan thousands of pages without interruption, including HTML5, JavaScript, and single-page applications. Acunetics provides accuracy with the lowest false positives by combining black box and white box testing. For more information, visit acunetics.com/securityweekly.
Welcome back, everyone, for the application security news for the week of December 16th. But first, quick announcement. If you are interested in quality over quantity and having meaningful conversations instead of just a badge scan, join us April 1st to the 3rd at Disney's Contemporary Resort for InfoSec World 2019, where you can connect and network with like-minded individuals in search of actionable information. Use the registration code OS19-SecWeek for 15% off the main conference world pass. With that, Paul, Facebook is having a really bad year. 6.8 million photos potentially basically leaked via API for yet another bug. This doesn't look good for Facebook. I mean, they've had what? I don't know, 3, 4, 7 breaches, it feels like, this year, and all in the millions of numbers potentially breached.
Well, yeah, I think that's because they have so many users, right?
Yeah,
Even a breach or potential breach that could expose a very small population of their users ends up being 5 to 10 million. And this is like 6.8 million, right? Just because of the sheer number of users that they have. This one was kind of interesting because I think it was you had to have a Facebook app that had access to your account, and then if it was of a certain type or probably using a certain type of API call, it could have gained access to all of your photos rather than none or some. I'm not sure exactly how I don't remember how that works. Because I mean, we do use a Facebook app thing, but it's not the one that would hit the user at any point in time. It's just to post stuff to a page. So.
Yeah, this one is, so interestingly, it was only for about 12 days, September 13th to September 25th of this year, that this is actually a problem. But yeah, it was an API call that third-party apps that Facebook allows, right? So in similar fashion to maybe like TweetDeck for Twitter, for example. So if you have like a third-party app that allows you to access maybe Facebook and a couple of other apps within it, it could access more than just the public photos through the API. So basically the API itself would allow for the leakage of potentially more photos via that API to the app.
Yeah, and I mean, and look, from a user perspective, if you're putting a picture on Facebook, whether you've marked it as public, private, or changed any of the settings on it, you should be doing that knowing that it's on the internet.
Yeah, right, exactly. Just because it's on Facebook and private doesn't mean that it's actually safe, is kind of the way to think about that. And you're absolutely right. In this case, it was 1,500 apps built by some 876 developers that may have had access. What's interesting here, though, is basically they're notifying the affected users who installed any of those apps and gave permission to access their photos. So what's interesting about that is Facebook knows that you installed that app, which is a little weird. And they know that you gave that app those permissions. So,
well, yeah, I think they do track that. And I think it's really for your benefit as a Facebook user that they're tracking what apps you've installed and what they're doing, because their API is very picky about that. It's very specific. Having worked a little bit with the Facebook API, it's very specific. If you want to do certain operations, you have to submit your app for approval, and there's a whole big long process to go through. So it is very tightly controlled, and I think it's actually good for Facebook that they know exactly the apps, exactly the developers, and exactly the people that are affected. I think that's showing some good at this time, showing some decent good diligence by Facebook. So.
That's true. That's absolutely true. And, hats off to them for catching it so quickly and remediating it so fast, right? I mean,
Yeah.
12 days, right? So if you think about in the course of that, you probably had at least one weekend. So it's more like 2 weeks of business time to actually detect, remediate, and fix the problem. Pretty awesome.
I hope next year we don't have to talk about, I hope we can talk about positive things for Facebook, not all the negative stuff.
It'd be really
right?
great.
It'd be really great.
I don't know that it's going to happen, Paul, but I
hope it does.
applaud your optimism.
Right.
And with that, actually, it's funny because at the very bottom of that article, they actually talked about the fact that Facebook wasn't the only major tech company to have breaches this year, as much as they made headlines. There was, of course, Twitter with the similar API issue that they had announced in September. And then Google's 2 API issues related to their Google Plus platform that is summarily being executed. So yeah, like all the big three pretty much had major breaches. I think the only one that I don't recall anything from is LinkedIn. So, knock on wood to that. Maybe we'll hear something early 2019. But
well, and I think, I haven't really looked at the LinkedIn API. I think that is probably the most locked down API out of all of them in my estimation. I haven't looked at any detail because I haven't necessarily interfaced with the LinkedIn API. But from what I gather, it's pretty locked down. Like it's hard to get a developer account, I think.
Well, that all depends, of course, on I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago we talked about that supposed breach or that data cache of what looked like LinkedIn data, right? So who knows?
Well, scraping is a different issue, and of course, LinkedIn, from what I've gathered, works very hard to try and prevent that. But as you know, it's only so much that you can do on that front. So. Yeah, very interesting.
Speaking of only so much you can do, and perhaps in a situation that they should have done more, this SQLite bug sounds really bad. And because there are so many apps affected by it, they haven't released any other details than to say it allows a remote attacker to execute arbitrary or malicious code on affected devices and leak program memory or crash applications. This sounds awful, Paul. Like SQLite is used in so many places.
Well, yeah, because it's a really fast and easy sort of SQL database. It is SQL, but
it's SQL.
It's light, as the name implies, right?
Well, so for my experience with it, I used it as just kind of a proof of concept database for the InfoSec Mentors project, which eventually ran on Postgres. But as a quick stand-up local test environment that has a lot of the same sort of syntactic sugar to it, SQLite is a good starting point for all of that, and a lot of people use it from a development standpoint. So we talked, I don't know, maybe about a month ago on how easy it was to exploit developer infrastructure. Here we go, right? Now you've got a remote code execution on SQLite, which, by the way, is probably used by a ton of developers locally on their box. And what do they have access to? Source code.
Yeah, I think there's certain performance benefits depending on the type of application you're building that SQLite is very, very good at as well. So you're going to see it in production, I think. More so than
probably. I wouldn't be surprised by that at all. One of the places that it's seen is IoT devices, right? Or of course, macOS or Windows apps, and Electron apps is the other big one.
Yeah.
So, the one thing that I found really interesting about this, by the way, is Chromium-based web browsers, which includes, of course, Chrome, Opera, Vivaldi, Brave, and Edge, in this case now, or soon to be, also support SQLite through the deprecated Web SQL Database API. And it was actually confirmed by Microsoft that after testing Chromium, it's affected by this as well.
Wow.
Which is really bad, because now you go to a site that maybe has some malicious code in it that actually abuses this exploit in some way, and you're off to the races. So not great in any stretch of the imagination. This will be probably when we talk about, I think, in early 2019, when we finally start to see exploit code, because it's used in other products by Adobe, Apple, Dropbox, Firefox, Android, Microsoft.
It's crazy. Yeah, it is used all over the place. The more you think about that, the more you'll come up with places that use it.
By the way, other things that are used all over the place, Jenkins, and also open to the internet with potentially remote code execution vulnerabilities and other nastiness. Jenkins.
That's really. I mean, I think we've seen it that the Docker engine, Kubernetes, and now Jenkins, right? And these are all critical components to your DevOps infrastructure. I think they probably capture the market share of what's out there if you're doing some kind of container environment and doing DevOps, you probably have those technologies out there, and they are all vulnerable. I mean, well, I think Docker and Kubernetes fall into the exposed APIs we pointed out in the previous segment being bad, and now you throw Jenkins into the mix. Now it has vulnerability. This is just I think it's going to be an evolution, right? I think next year we're going to see a lot more of this, and as I've predicted before, until it starts to settle down. All these technologies are new. All of them are going to have these flaws that are exposed, and I think not as many DevOps shops as I would like are really conscious of applying security down to this level, like including in their threat modeling. What if this is vulnerable, or you're pushing out a new architecture so fast that you're missing out? So you're missing some of these pieces that are critical to your security architecture.
Absolutely. And in this case as well, usually you're going to see, again, Docker or Kubernetes has actually got something that is publicly facing, whether it's the application that lives in the container is, exposed to the internet because it's hosting your web server, for example.
Right.
That Jenkins would be exposed to the internet is concerning. And I have seen it in some of the bug bounty programs that I've been a part of, which would probably, I should go back and look at any of those targets, because with these two bugs, you could provide a malformed login credential which caused Jenkins servers to move their config.xml file from the home directory to another location. So now if the server restarts, maybe it gets a new patch, or like maybe people are going out and patching it for this very bug, for example. It has the situation where the server boots in a default configuration that has no security. Like, talk about an opportunity to build in security by default so that this doesn't happen. Jenkins,
right?
Anyone that develops Jenkins that you listens to the show, maybe an opportunity to rethink that, because that's not great. Because malformed login, like, who would ever do that? Like every security tester / potential malicious person under the sun.
Well, and it's interesting, as we automate more and look at the CI/CD pipeline, and we have tools such as these, the security around them has to be really high, because in the wrong hands, I mean, essentially you're turning over the keys to the kingdom to an attacker, because they're set up to take those automated operations in your DevOps process.
Yeah, these sit right in the most critical point of that pipeline process, which is usually automation into your code repository, or automation for deployment, right? Or both in some cases, which is the worst possible place to be exploited. And the other exploit that's associated with this, by the way, Paul, is that you could have basically creating an ephemeral user record in the server's memory with the second bug, which would allow an attacker a short period of time where they could authenticate using a ghost username and credentials, which I imagine would look really interesting if you're running like DFIR, because suddenly you've got user credentials logging in that just don't exist anywhere and were never created.
Right.
Like, talk about a nightmare. So basically, the folks that did some research on this, including ZDNet, by the way, who did the research under Catalin Compagnie, who did the article, they found something like 2,000 vulnerable Jenkins servers, probably out on Shodan, within just a few minutes. So, yeah, not great. If you have exposed Jenkins, patch fast, and maybe even run a little bit of incident response to make sure that you're checking.
Haven't been owned already. Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, because you might be. One of the other ones I know, Paul, that you wanted to talk about was the whole thing with Signal and this new Australian, encryption law that they've come out with. So we talked about the encryption law back on PSW last week. So I think that was 585, 586 for last week's episode of Paul Security Weekly. So we won't cover it here. But Signal came back with a rather interesting response, which is basically, get stuffed. It's not going to happen. We can't actually include it. I think they made some pretty good points in this article.
Yeah, and we were speculating about this on Paul Security Weekly last week, and I think that Signal has definitely nailed it in terms of, like, we don't control the keys. Like, the end users choose the keys and encrypt messages to each other, and that's outside of the purview of Signal, so therefore we're not able to comply because we can't backdoor our users' encryption because the keys are out of our hands.
The other thing that they point out pretty readily is, by the way, this is open source. So we can't include a backdoor in the Signal, because guess what? Everybody can look at the source code. You want us to include a backdoor? People are going to find that thing so fast and probably exploit it.
Yes.
It's hilarious because the situation, as we started to speculate on Pulse Security Weekly last week, and I think it was 586, is basically that you're going to have a situation where, okay, so the government of Australia decides to blacklist Signal. Well, guess what? A lot of other countries, China, probably Russia, and others have tried to do the same thing. And guess what? People still find a way to use it or to download it, right? So it just kind of goes to show that, yeah, you can try to change the rules of the game, but that horse has already left the barn, and closing the doors now isn't going to do you any good. So maybe get better at your investigative techniques and start to do a little bit more on that side of things, because guess what? The encryption ain't going to help you. In trying to make people, unlock their crypto is just not going to work for things like Signal. And there's only going to be more situations like Signal, not less.
And it's interesting as you try and say, well, you can't use this. If it's open source, I can change it so many different ways to give it a different signature in so many different ways that trying to block it would be very, very difficult.
Yeah, what are you going to do? Block GitHub at the edge, right? Like everybody's code lives there. Yep. So that's going to be a whole problem where, okay, I can just go get the source code and compile it myself. I don't even need to download the application.
Yep.
And short of blocking GitHub, there are probably going to be enough forks of it that, good luck.
Signal is problematic because it does such a good job of putting the encryption in the hands of the end user. It's fallen victim to the operating systems it runs on are very insecure. There's been at least 2 incidents where people said, "Oh, there's a flaw in Signal and they should fix it." And no, if you look back in history where Signal came from and how the architecture looks and how it's dealt with this issue in the past, is they're not responsible if you have poor OPSEC or your operating system's insecure. They've done everything they can to ensure the privacy of their users, and that they're not at fault for a lot of you will see articles that we've covered them in the past. One time we actually heard from Moxie Marlinspike at Signal and was like, no, the press is really trying to basically pick on Signal, but it's largely unjustified because it's the fault of wherever they run on. And that's one reason why I trust Signal. And I think it's hard if you're trying to do any kind of monitoring of any kind of enterprise communications, Signal blows your theory out of the water because anyone can install the app and have end-to-end encryption between them using their own keys. So
So what are you going to do? Block Signal and iPhones? It's just not going to happen in the Australian market. And as I started to speculate as well, again on Pulse Security Weekly, it's either Australia's going to have to make its own phones at this point with their own operating system on that phone and all the software made in Australia, which just probably isn't going to happen.
Nope.
Or this law is effectively going to fall flat somewhere, and it's going to become impossible. And they're probably going to just start putting punitive measures around if you don't unlock it, right? So that whole idea of you have a right of innocence until proven guilty kind of gets thrown out the door when you do that sort of thing. So I don't know. It's a mess, to say the least.
And speaking of messes, we get to talk about WordPress now.
Yes, we do. So again, Catalan continue. So WordPress plugs a bug that lets Google index some of the user's passwords, which is what? Okay. So WordPress recently released the 5.0 branch, and then basically shortly thereafter, they released a 5.0.1 set of fixes for 7 security vulnerabilities, some of which allowed for site takeover, which is wow, really, guys? Your WordPress? You should have this down by now, I think. And yeah, it's just basically what you had is you could do specially crafted searches in Google where an attacker could find the pages and collect users' email addresses, and in some rare cases, default generated passwords based on the way that Google was indexing the new WordPress instances under 5.0. It's what year is it again? Are we about to go into 2019 and WordPress is releasing wildly vulnerable releases to the public and Google's just indexing them? I can't believe
it's
this
just
ball.
Crazy.
It's crazy.
I mean, it's a time trade-off, right? In all of the time you save implementing WordPress to get that easy, quick access to functionality, you lose so much of that in just the administrative overhead to administering WordPress, which is kind of where I'm at right now. Is I've got WordPress instances to maintain, and so much of our time is going towards trying to lock them down and keep up to date with multiple fronts. You got to make sure your PHP is in the latest version, right? Because if WordPress is running on an older version of PHP, you're screwed. You got to make sure WordPress is up to date, and they just released 5.0. Now it's 5.01. So you got to do that again. Your plugins have to be updated, which is an ongoing task depending on how many you have. And your themes. Don't forget your themes. There's code in your themes that can be exploited. So those have to be kept up to date, including the ones you're not actively using, because the theme is still there. The code is still there and can be exploited. So it's hard.
Yeah. And not to mention, of course, the other bugs in this whole thing are not great either. For example, they had external XXE, external XML entities allowing server-side request forgery, as well as unserialization problems based on, of course, the PHP-based framework. As I was reading through this, I was just like, this is a train wreck. This is like a way to go out of 2018 in flames.
Well, then if you're hosting the operating system, you got to patch the operating system and all the libraries and applications. And then you got to worry about the web server that WordPress is running on that's linked to PHP. And then if you're running the database, you got to worry about patching the database server along with all those other things that I just mentioned. If we need something new that has, and I haven't seen a good recommendation, something new that has a lot of functionality, that is secure, that uses a newer architecture, that you don't have to worry about all of these components to be your new CMS.
So not running PHP, not using SQLite, and perhaps is a much better ecosystem problem than, say, WordPress. So I don't know, Paul. I think that WordPress is going to be around like Flash, right? It's just going to keep holding on and be this zombie software for decades that we just have to put up with with marketing teams everywhere.
But I don't think it's just marketing teams, and I think it's not like Flash where people are largely moving away from it. More and more people are moving to it every day. So this is, in essence, a much larger problem than Flash, except it's not on people's desktops. It's out on the web, but still, I think it's going to be around for a long time.
Well, especially because I think it's PHP 5.6 or 5.7 is going end of life in like, I don't know, less than 2 weeks, which is a whole nother host of issues, especially for older WordPress instances that aren't being updated. So we're going to be talking about WordPress next year, Paul. I just get this.
We are. Yeah, WordPress is going to be a thing we're always talking about, I think.
So speaking of other cool things worth talking about, by the way, I wanted to go ahead and highlight this one tool. It's called Swiftness X. So it is an Electron-based cross-platform note-taking tool for penetration testing. So I know I talked about Serpico last week under Learning and Tools. This one was another one that looks pretty nicely built. I haven't played with it yet myself, but in terms of, again, cross-platform tool that people can use to track their work from a perspective of, I don't know, running bug bounty tests against WordPress instances. It seems like a really cool, lightweight tool worth checking out. So definitely go see that. That's story number 1 under Learning and Tools.
Yeah, there's a lot of tools like this, Keith. And I was telling someone earlier, it's actually the CEO and founder of a company called Polarity. He was asking me like about my note-taking process for things. I'm like, well, I have a remarkable tablet because Keith recommended I get one. But like when you're on the screen doing stuff, I'm like, I'm always copying and pasting into, well, VI, all right, in my case. And there's a lot of better tools that are integrated with your workflow. And it's one of the things that I believe Polarity can offer as a feature. And now, we're covering something similar on the show, more geared towards if you're writing a report. Polarity has a different enterprise play, but interesting nonetheless that I think the way that we will take notes as we're doing things is going to change. There'll be better tools that will have vulnerabilities more than likely.
that will be running SQLite, and you have to go patch them really quick.
Oh yeah, and just Swiftness is Node.js, so that's why I say that.
Right. So the other things that I wanted to mention under Learning and Tools, because I know we haven't talked about it too much, is there are 2 really good books that I've enjoyed quite a lot. One is Project to Product, which is currently something that I'm reading and have enjoyed for just talking about the state of change inside of the industry and of course inside of where we're going in terms of DevOps and in terms of the way that we actually build software and where we need to go. So that's by Mick. Let me actually pull it over here. It's by Mick Kirsten. I actually have it over on my bookshelf now. So I'm currently reading through that, and I've enjoyed it quite a lot because it calls out a lot of the things that I think get overlooked in the whole DevOps transformation process. So that was one that I wanted to mention. The other book that I really have enjoyed, and I've enjoyed all of their work, is by Jason Fried and David Heinemeier Hansen, which is It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work. They're very candid in their books, and they're actually pretty short and very consumable. So if you ever get a chance to go read anything by either of them, it's well worth it. And for more modern developers or more modern businesses today, I think they'll get where the authors are coming from. But if you're working in traditional enterprise today, man, you're in for a treat. You'll probably highlight just about every other paragraph, as I did in my case reading that as well. Paul, I know there were a couple other stories though worth mentioning here. I don't know if you wanted to talk about any of them. Jira is an anti-pattern, which I thought was a pretty good call out, but also the need for sustainable, free, open source communities, which I also enjoyed reading that article. So we can talk about either as we wrap up.
Yeah, I didn't read the Jira article. What was the gist of that one?
So basically, they're calling out Jira as not being a good thing for holding a map of where the product is actually trying to go. It's being treated as basically a bunch of mini waterfalls inside of most development shops today, which I thought was hilarious because they're pretty accurate on the way that they were calling that out. So basically, they're saying don't let Jira become a map or a primary map in model for project completion, because it actually doesn't help, because it's just mini waterfalls and is a series of developments toward a certain end goal. And most of the time, the people that are working on it don't know what the end goal is. So they make bad decisions in the development process that don't necessarily fit the end use case.
I can see that because I think Jira's been around and was probably tuned for waterfall development and has had to make the changes to support DevOps, and showing some of its roots that are difficult to change. So.
For sure. The other one that I thought was really great was actually Sustainable Free and Open Source Communities, or sfosc.org. So this was a really great article by Adam Jacob that recently was released, coinciding with a website that actually talks about the need for building good open source communities to both build better software, but also for those companies that are thinking of building a business model around open sourcing their software, really taking a consideration for what that does to the way you build your community and what that means to the community you're trying to build. I've read the ebook over the weekend on sfosc.org. I've also actually committed a couple of PRs for typo changes that I found in the process. So true to open source, I went ahead and read it and then committed the changes.
Yeah, and I think sustainable is important here, right? And it's one of the problems we talk about is, how do you pass off your open source project now securely to someone you trust, and how do you know who to trust, and how do you make sure that what you're creating is sustainable and having a plan for moving into the future? I think that's one thing that could help the problem of all of the open source software vulnerabilities that we have, and even just functionality wise. You're relying on something that isn't being updated as often. How do you create a sustainable? I think a lot of people set out to do that from the beginning and then lose interest and move on. It's one of the beauties of open source. You can create all kinds of stuff, but now that we're more reliant upon it, I think in technology in general, how does it become more sustainable? That's an interesting topic for me, for sure.
Yeah, great website, great article. I encourage everyone to go ahead and read that. That's going to be story number 3 under the food for thought. And then the last one, of course, is our commit strip. I actually went back to about a year ago to find this one. It's the commit strip comic of the week, which is all about security versus business. And I thought our readers might enjoy that as well. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us this year for Application Security Weekly. We'll see you again in 2019. Happy holidays, Happy New Year. And of course, in the meantime, remember to git commit and stay classy.